Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the second session of the distinguished lecture series in social theory. The title of today's lecture by Professor Cheng is What Humaneness Means in Terms of Governance, Past and Present. May I now request Professor Parthasarathi Mondal, the chairperson, Center for Social Theory, TISS, to come to the dais to chair the session. I welcome Professor Cheng, Chair, Intellectual History of China, Collège de France, in our midst. I also invite Mr. Vital Natkarni, eminent journalist, to the dais. Now I request Jackson to present the bouquet to the members of the dais. Thank you. For those who could not come yesterday, Professor Cheng was trained in European and Chinese intellectual history at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, at Oxford and Cambridge in Great Britain, and at Fudan University in Shanghai. After an academic career as a research fellow at CNRS, National Center for Scientific Research, then as a professor at INALCO, National Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilizations, she currently holds the chair of Chinese Intellectual History at the Collège de France. Her main publications include a complete translation into French of the Confucian Analects, a study of Han Confucianism, and a history of Chinese thought. She has also authored a great number of articles and chief edited several collective volumes on Chinese philosophy and Chinese thought today. Since 2010, she directs a bilingual series of works written in classical Chinese and translated into French at the editions des Belles Lettres. Now over to Professor Mondal, the moderator of this session.
Thank you, Shilanand. Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy that all of you managed to come despite your very hectic schedule. I'm aware of your examinations and assignments. It's a bit early in the day also for TISS, 10 o'clock. So thanks nevertheless. Hopefully more people will join us. We have this, very rare opportunity to have, someone speak to us about China. And as I was mentioning yesterday, out of the, the normal geopolitical and security paradigm. It's a very welcome talk to understand the roots of Chinese civilization then and now. Yesterday we had a very interesting philological study based upon Confucian's idea as an attempt to understand China by Professor Cheng. And today she will make an effort to relate the type of philosophical thinking with contemporary China. And hopefully she was very kind enough to have a very long and extended question answer session yesterday. So I hope she would be kind enough to answer our queries if you have any after the talk. Without wasting too much time, Professor Cheng.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, enough time meaning? Yeah. All right. So, can you hear me? Yes, yes. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I realized that 10 o'clock is a bit early for everyone. I'm just, you know, sort of hardly woken up, but I hope I'm lucid enough to talk to you. I would like to renew my thanks first to Professor Mondal for inviting me to TIS. I feel both very honored and very touched by this invitation, because for me, India has always been a very important interlocutor, and it has been sometimes difficult, I mean, to engage in some kind of real conversation, and I'm really grateful for this occasion to let's say take up this conversation with you all, and by the way, thank you all for being here this morning. Yesterday we already had a very lively and interesting discussion with those present yesterday, but today I'm just hoping to carry on the discussion. As Professor Mondal has been recounting, yesterday I took up this rather, you know, tricky exercise of, some of you have been wondering about my method of, you know, my pedagogical method. I've been trying to expatiate on certain concepts and let's say terms, key words in the Confucian teaching, the ancient Confucian teaching, and from there trying to expound a few fundamental tenets in Confucian political theory. And today the endeavor will be to, let's say, bring these, let's say, traditional and classical tenets into, let's say, what we usually call modernity in the Western sense. And of course, this again will be a difficult exercise because, as you all know, you can't think of anything more radically opposed, if not totally incompatible, as, you know, on the one hand, modernity understood in the Western sense, that is inherited from Enlightenment and industrialized Europe, and on the other, such an entity as, you know, Confucianism, which immediately conjures up the burden of a tradition spanning more than 2 millennia and readily associated with a strongly hierarchic and historically immutable socio-political order. So, I mean, you take these two terms and you just wonder how you're going to sort of make them function together. So we should, of course, start by pointing out the problematic character of the two terms themselves and the even more problematic character of the relationship between them. And of course, you are all aware of the fierce debates that have surrounded the notion of modernity, especially now that we're supposed to have moved on to a so-called postmodern age. So, I mean, it's already difficult enough, I mean, to define what modernity is, but I mean, you know, does it help to move on to postmodernity? So I think that in the Indian context, you know, you have been grappling with these issues as well. But it should also be reminded that the term Confucianism, and I was already, you know, sort of talking about this yesterday, the term itself, Confucianism, was originally a neologism coined in the 19th century at a time when Europe constructed and organized Western knowledge into different academic categories, such as philosophy or history of religions. So in such a framework, Confucianism was supposed to represent a kind of religion or set of beliefs attached to this character called Confucius, in Chinese Kongzi, Master Kong, who lived in the 6th to 5th centuries before the Common Era, but who in his Latinized version was himself, to a certain extent, an invention of the Jesuit missionaries back in the 17th and 18th centuries. So when you talk about Confucianism, you're already, sort of dealing with a very, complex package. So I suppose you have the same problem with Hinduism, which is some kind of an invention of the European and more specifically, English history of religions. So the problem is that such a term as Confucianism has no equivalent in Chinese. You take the Chinese name of Confucius, Master Kong, Kongzi, and you don't have any, Kongziism in Chinese. So, it's a pure, European invention. So, I think that I may be wrong, maybe you're terribly familiar with Chinese history and especially Chinese modern history. In that case, I'll skip the whole first part of my...
people don't know, so please...
Okay, so, I'm, sort of first and foremost a teacher, so, I want things to be accessible, to whoever, is willing to listen to me. So maybe it might be in order to recount as briefly as possible what I would call the long march of China to modernity, and to underline the major role played by Confucianism in this long and complex process, which can be said to go 1.5 centuries, that is to the mid-19th century. Here on this slide, you have the, sort of perfunctory, reminder about, something like 3,000 years of Chinese history. This is, of course, grossly summarized, you see, but you have a vague notion of all this, high antiquity, and followed by 2,000 years of imperial history. And if we move on to the next slide, we have, let's say, starting from the 1840s, 1860s, that is the mid-19th century, that is the Opium Wars in China. You have, the beginning of what I've just been calling the long march of China to modernity. And so in the 19th century, you have a first wave of reactions in China against Western supremacy, which took the form of the claim that sprouts, the Chinese use the word sprouts, of elements perceived as being part of Western knowledge and power already existed in the Chinese tradition. I think you would find, the same kind of endeavors and efforts you see in the Indian context. You see, claiming that maybe the Indians, you see, invented, nuclear power, in the 3rd millennia before the Common Era or something like that. You see, so you have just the same kind of endeavor in China. So the first thrust towards this search for precedents, for, so to speak, was brought about by the consciousness after the Opium Wars of the 1840s to the 1860s, the consciousness of Western supremacy, not only in material and technological terms, but also in cultural terms. So, I mean, it took about, you know, half a century for the Chinese to realize, you see, that, I mean, these Westerners were not only superior in terms of, you know, material conditions and technology, but also, you know, in cultural terms, you see. I mean, it took them quite a long time to accept this. So this is why the Chinese found it necessary to look into their own tradition for precedents or sprouts, you know, capable of outwitting the set of values which, as they saw it, had contributed to building Western superiority. That is, you know, religion, philosophy, science, democracy. So just to give you an example, you have in Chinese antiquity this thinker or philosopher called Mencius, you see, who lived in the 4th century before the Common Era. And he was credited for having formulated the sprouts of democracy in Chinese antiquity. And there, you know, the Chinese intellectuals of the 19th century would, you know, so tap on, you know, Confucian canonical scriptures, you see, and which we have evoked yesterday, you see. So they would quote from these canonical Confucian sources to claim that Mencius, I mean, this ancient 4th century before the Common Era philosopher, you know, had already, you know, sort of formulated some sprouts of democratic thinking. And he was also supposed to be let's say, the ancient thinker of the idea of a republic, you see. So, of course, I mean, this is all, you know, completely anachronistic, but that's the kind of endeavor, you know, that the modern Chinese intellectuals, you know, came up with to counter this, what they perceive to be this Western supremacy. So the process of reinventing tradition intensified towards the close of the 19th century, and especially after, let's say, the year 1895, which was the deeply traumatic experience of China's defeat against Japan. We should be reminded that to the Chinese mind, I mean, Japan had already, you know, had always been a sort of vassal, I mean, to the Chinese empire. You know, Japan was just a satellite, and of course, being, you know, sort of defeated by this former satellite was generally considered as being the moment when it was no longer possible to believe, you know, like the first modernizers after the Opium Wars, that one could learn and benefit from Western techniques without necessarily affecting the substance, I mean, the very core of Chinese culture. You know, during the second half of the 19th century, there was a very, let's say, successful motto which, you know, was a 4-character formula. You know, I mean, Chinese can be very, you know, sort of economical, because, I mean, you know, one word is one syllable, and you can compact, you see, quite complex ideas, you see, into something like 4-character or 4-syllable formulas. And this formula said, in Chinese, it's 中体西用. So it means, 中 meaning, you know, China, meaning the middle. So you can keep China, or the Chinese culture, as 体, meaning the essential body, and Xi meaning the West, you know, and borrow from the West, you know, just the techniques and the technology, you know. So that four-character formula actually said that you could actually, you know, sort of just borrow from, let's say, Western technology while, you know, keeping the Chinese essence, okay? So this formula, you know, which was valid, I mean, sort of in the minds of Chinese intellectuals over the, let's say, the second half of the 19th century, you know, by 1895, you know, was proven to be completely invalid because I mean, the defeat of China against Japan, you know, was, you know, sort of a blatant proof, you know, that this motto wasn't valid any longer. So the idea started to take over that China needed a thorough reform of its political institutions, along the lines of what Japan had been doing since 1868, you see, with the Meiji reforms aimed at strengthening Japan through westernization. So Japan had already, you know, for a generation already, you know, taken some, you know, advance, you see, on the rest of Asia. And I think, you know, I seem to have understood that Japan, even to India, you know, by the end of the 19th century, was also appearing as a model, you know, to imitate. So China also, you know, sort of became aware that the Japanese Meiji reforms were to be, you know, sort of imitated. So that's why just 3 years later, in 1898, during one of the very last reigns of the Manchu Qing dynasty, a group of scholars led by the great Cantonese thinker Kuan Yew and his disciple Liang Qichao undertook for the first time in imperial history to sketch out a series of political reforms, creating the basis of a constitutional monarchy following the Japanese model. And here, you know, in 1898, that's called the 100 Days Reform. You have the very first attempt in the whole of Chinese imperial history at, you know, let's say, reforming radically the political system. But significantly enough, this 100 Days Reform, you know, failed miserably, and Kuan Yew and his disciples had to flee to Japan. Because as a traditional scholar, you know, Kuan Yew was you know, trained in the classical Confucian scriptures that I've been evoking yesterday. So Kuan Yew was still believing that it was still possible to make use once again of Confucian canonical sources in order to achieve political reform. But, you know, this attempt failed, and it was the very last time that the Confucian scriptures were resorted to, you know, in these modernist political reforms. So by thinking out and implementing his action within the framework of Confucian practices, Kuan Yew paradoxically and unintentionally undermined the very last foundations of tradition. And this last culturalist effort ended up, as I've just said, in a complete fiasco. As a result, whereas Meiji Japan succeeded in achieving political transformation as early as 1868, China missed its chance in 1898, just 30 years later, by continuing to refer to a canonical tradition which did not permit the establishment of a true nation state. So 1898, you see, is really, you know, a decisive moment, because here you have the feeling that China missed the step in a way. So this traditionalist failure resulted in a huge gap in political construction, which the successive revolutions of the 20th century would subsequently but ineffectively seek to fill. So in fact, political opposition became more radical after the fiasco of the 100 Days Reform. Without doubt, one of the main causes of the anti-Manchu revolution of 1911, which brought about the total collapse of the Manchu dynasty, and with it of the whole imperial system, giving way to the very first Republican era in Chinese history in 1912, with Sun Yat-sen, you see, as its president. Sun Yat-sen being also a Cantonese. So, I mean, the Chinese movement of modernization could be said to have started from the south, you see, Canton being in the very south of China. So, what I'm trying to argue, and this may be, challenged by some historians, but I have a definite feeling that, after missing this step in 1898, you have a whole history, sort of modern and even contemporary history of China in the 20th century, which is a succession of failures, you see, I mean, to fill this political gap, you see. I may be wrong, but this is going to be a matter for discussion later on. So in 1911, the whole imperial regime, which had managed to last something like 2,000 years, collapsed, so giving way to the establishment of the very first republic in Chinese history. And at the same time, institutional Confucianism, which had been the ideological foundation of the imperial regime, also disappeared. In fact, after having functioned for centuries, the examination system for bureaucratic recruitment, notably based on the knowledge of Confucian texts, had been abolished in 1905, just a few years earlier. And 1905, the abolition of the civil examination system marked the end of what some historians call the scriptural Confucianism, which had been the mainstay, of the imperial regime. So the culturalist option, chosen by Kuan Yew, tended to be overshadowed by political radicalization, which, after the setback of the first Republican experience of 1912, reached its climax with the 1919 May 4th movement. And this movement, in a very interesting way, was initially set off by students in Peking already, who protested on Tiananmen Square. Okay, so you can see that there are some, sort of recurrences, you see, in history, and those students were protesting against the announcement made in the Versailles Treaty in Europe that former German possessions in China had been handed over to Japan. So China always considered the Versailles Treaty as the sort of iniquitous treaties, because Germany and Japan were supposed to be on the vanquished side, you see, whereas China had been allied to France and England. And, it found completely, iniquitous that actually Japan, took advantage of this Versailles Treaty. So the May 4th, 1919 movement marked the beginning of a period of great political agitation. But paradoxically enough, this movement, which was directed against, let's say, the imperialist and colonial powers, defined itself by means of the resolutely Western terms of science in the singular and democracy. So, I mean, these students were both protesting against the Versailles Treaty and at the same time, sort of upholding what they perceived as major Western values such as science and democracy. And the veneration for these two personified entities, you see, I mean, they were called Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, was matched only by the violence aimed against Chinese tradition, identified as a whole as Confucian. So down with Confucius and with his shop was the preferred slogan of the Chinese modernists who held Confucianism as a whole responsible for all of China's evils, its material and moral backwardness. Okay, so the interesting thing is that you'll find some echoes of this slogan, down with Confucius and his shop, you see, later on, as we shall see. So such a slogan reflected the frustrations of intellectuals struggling with the Chinese reality of humiliation and desperate search for modernity. So this explains the apparently paradoxical character of the May 4th movement, which was launched in the name of the most extreme anti-traditionalism and advocating a radically new culture whose modernity was tantamount to total westernization. But at the same time, it constituted a national or even nationalistic protest against the great Western powers, which, by the way, included Japan. Okay, so I'm always, reluctant in using this binary opposition between the East and the West, you see, because at that time, when the Chinese were protesting against the West, I mean, it also included Japan, which geographically is situated at the east of China, okay? So, and also, by the way, I always remind my students, you see, that when China first referred to the West, back in the, let's say, 4th century of the Common Era, I mean, it meant India. Okay, so then, if you take, European representations, you see, the East would start, with let's say, Persia, you see, and of course, India and China were already sort of shoved, to the sort of remote Orient. But so this binary opposition is always a matter of viewpoints, anyway. So by looking for Western-style modernization, the iconoclasts of the May 4th movement went in the same direction as Marxist analysis, which associated Confucianism as an ideology with this social infrastructure characteristic of an overall feudal period. So Confucianism could thus be conveniently relegated to the museum of history without interfering with the process of modernization. Okay, so let's say in the early 20th century, Confucianism was just, sort of thrown overboard, you see. I mean, these Chinese intellectuals tended to throw the baby, with the bathwater in some way. So in the 1920s, another Western diagnosis condemned Confucianism even more radically. That is the diagnosis of Max Weber, whose name I already mentioned yesterday, this German sociologist who died precisely in 1920, and whose concern it was to demonstrate the ideological factors that is, according to him, Protestant ethics, at the origin of capitalism in Europe. So thinking he had identified the material conditions necessary for the advent of capitalism in China, Weber came to the conclusion that if capitalism had not yet happened in China, then it was due to ideological factors, and the most important one, to his mind, was Confucianism. You know, as I said yesterday, to Weber, China and Confucianism were the perfect counterexample to his grand thesis about, you know, Protestant ethics being, you know, sort of the explaining factor for the rise of capitalism in Europe. So doing away with this burden that is Confucianism thus seemed to be the indispensable condition before one could proceed to Western-style modernization. So the impact of the Western new scientific rationality, which destroyed the cosmological and holistic vision predominant in Chinese tradition, and which I've evoked yesterday. So the impact of this new rationality added to these negative diagnoses. So the intellectuals of the 1920s who sought to preserve Confucian thought initially directed their resistance against the limitless faith modernists had in science in the singular. So they did not question the capacity of science to explain the universe, but they were opposed to its application to human beings. These, let's say, Confucian modern intellectuals tried to reassert the superiority in this domain of the Confucian philosophy of life, or the Confucian humaneness, you see, which I talked about yesterday, raised to the rank of metaphysics and of an ethical system. So they did try to, let's say, adapt, you know, the Confucian humane philosophy, you know, into Western categories of, you know, philosophy, that is, metaphysics and ethics. So these new Confucians, some of whom had studied in Japanese, European, or American universities, did their best to endow the Confucian cultural heritage with philosophical dignity, which would make it more credible for the West and help to preserve it after the disappearance of scriptural and institutional Confucianism. And in this way, they sought an alternative path towards modernity, which would take their own intellectual tradition into account. And I think that I found it very interesting especially when I was in Kolkata, you know, just a year ago, to Bengali intellectuals, you see that some, you know, sort of analogous efforts were being made also in the Indian context, you see, to the same effect. So 30 years, or let's say one generation after 1919, the People's Republic of China was established in 1949 by the communists, and there we were sort of moving on to something maybe more familiar to you. And of course, this takeover by the communists forced a number of intellectuals hostile to Marxism into exile. Mainly to Taiwan and Hong Kong. You know, very interestingly, as you know, Hong Kong is coming back, you know, forefront. You see, with his protests. So maybe what I'm going to say now will be, you know, will help understand something about what's going on now. So you have, let's say, a first generation of those new Confucians I've been just mentioning, who remained in mainland China, but after 1949, Taiwan, with the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, you know, who took refuge on Taiwan, you know, Taiwan tried very hard to appear as the living conservatory of traditional Chinese culture. So you have these attempts of these anti-Marxist intellectuals, you see, I mean, to resist the idea that Confucianism should be, you know, sort of moved away, you know, to the museum of history. So certain second generation new Confucians also flocked together in Hong Kong to found the New Asia College, which is still present, you know, today in Hong Kong on the Chinese University campus. So in 1958, 4 of these new Confucians, among the most prominent intellectuals outside of communist China, signed on the first page of the Hong Kong journal Democratic Tribune, I quote, a manifesto addressed to the world for a re-evaluation of Chinese studies and a reconstruction of Chinese culture, in which these 4 intellectuals were beseeching, this was the term used, they were beseeching their fellow intellectuals in the whole world to accept the idea that Chinese culture was not dead and that Confucian philosophy was still a living source of values and could even serve as the basis of a new universal form of humanism, integrating the democratic political ideal. So you have this endeavor, you know, coming from these anti-Marxist intellectuals, you see, to integrate, you know, democratic values into, let's say, the traditional Confucian mindset. So the poignant tone of the 1958 appeal, you know, they were beseeching their fellow intellectuals, you see, to believe that Confucianism was not dead, clearly depicts the mentality of this generation in exile, confronted with the trauma of the communist takeover of China. However, whereas mainland China's pursuit of modernization, at first using the Soviet model, had relegated these new Confucians to a marginal position, a spectacular about-turn was to take place starting in the 1980s. That is right after the Cultural Revolution, you know, the so-called Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which lasted for 10 years, you see, between 1966 and 1976. So in the 1980s, you have this complete about-turn in which Confucianism became, so to speak, overnight. You know, I mean, Confucianism was so far considered as an insuperable obstacle to modernity, as we've just seen, you see, I mean, according to the Marxist and the Weberian diagnosis. But overnight, it became the very central motor of modernization, okay? So, you know, in the 1980s, I mean, you have this completely spectacular about-turn. So the origin of this about-turn had in fact little to do with Confucianism itself, but rather with a completely new historical and economical situation. So after the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution, that is after the death of Mao in 1976, the revolutionary Maoist model was to all intents and purposes abandoned in China itself, while at the margins of China's geographical space, what were called at that time the 4 little dragons, that is Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore and South Korea, were following in the footsteps of Japan, experiencing an unprecedented economic boom, you know. So these 4 little dragons, you see, were coming in the wake of, you know, Japan's economic success. And you notice, you see, from the mention of these 4 little dragons, that at least 3 of them, that is Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, are mainly populated by, sort of people of Chinese origin, you see. And of course, as a result, these little dragons became the object of considerable attention and emulation, in particular from Western experts, who got terribly excited about this, new, let's say, Asiatic model in economics. So indeed, at a time when communism in China, but also in Eastern Europe, was going through a major crisis, capitalist Western societies perceived what they believed to be signs of the decline of their own development. So you have these, concomitant phenomena. So in this context, what were called at that time Asian, or in the Chinese context, Confucian values, were supposed to account for the boom of a specifically Asian form of capitalism, and appeared as a convenient remedy to the failure of the Western model of modernity. So at the end of the 1970s, you find the Singaporean government of Kuan Yew, which planned, I quote, an increased injection of Asian values in the school curriculum as a means of countering the West's cultural hold on young people, end of quote. I mean, that's Lee Kuan Yew's prose, you see. So by the middle of the 1980s, the Asian values contagion had spread to the People's Republic, which since the end of the 1970s was busy settling its Maoist legacy, and very much wanted to jump on the bandwagon of Pan-Asianism so as, if possible, to take over its leadership. So Confucianism vilified, attacked, and even physically destroyed for several generations, with a peak of violence during the Cultural Revolution, which has just come to an end, began to be rehabilitated officially as early as 1978. By the highest authorities of the Chinese Communist Party. And in 1992, during his famous tour of the southern provinces, Deng Xiaoping referred to Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore as being a model for China. So you have this, again, I mean, this spectacular about turn concerning Confucianism, which had been vilified starting from the 1919 May 4th movement, down to the Cultural Revolution, which was in a way a sort of remake of the May 4th movement, but several generations later. And I just wanted to show you, well, I could just use this, stark contrast, you see, between what was happening, in the 1960s and 70s, you see, during the Cultural Revolution. Here you have the a group of Red Guards, you see, conscientiously destroying, the temple of Confucius in Confucius' birthplace, you see, in Qufu, in Shandong province, you see, here in the background you can see some slogans, you see, they're pasted on the wall, and if you can read them, you would find that they are echoes of the 1919 May 4th slogan. I mean, this one says, you see, down with Confucius, and his followers. Okay, so here you have another, picture of the Piling Pikong, the campaign of criticism against Lin Biao and against Confucius. You see, with in a train bringing some activists to Peking for a demonstration. And so the Piling Pikong, for those of you who are, you know, sort of not of, let's say, the latest generation, it might ring a bell. I mean, you know, sort of packing together Lin Biao, who appeared to Mao as a dangerous rival, and actually Lin Biao was sort of, you know, eliminated, you see, after this campaign. And packing together Lin Biao and Confucius would seem rather, you know, irrational to you, but it would, I mean, it at least shows you that Mao considered, you know, his enemies to be, you know, let's say, given over to the Confucian ideology. So, I mean, Confucianism was very much the, let's say, class enemy during the Cultural Revolution. And if you take the next picture, you have here a statue of Confucius, okay, which is now, which has been erected, you know, in the 1980s, and which is significantly enough standing at the entrance of the campus of the People's University, you know, Renmin Daxue, you know, in Peking. And thing to remember that the People's University was created back in the 1930s as a training school for the Communist Party members. Okay, so I quite, you know, sort of like this contrast, you see, between these people who are about, you know, in their 20s or 30s, you see, in the 1970s, and you take the same people, okay, later on in their 60s, and the same ones, you see, erect this statue to this statue of Confucius, you see, while being in power, you know, because now, I mean, the power is in the hands of those people, you know, who were, you know, sort of former Red Guards, you see, and those people who, you know, were intent on destroying, you know, the Confucius temple, you know, back in the 1970s, are the same ones who sort of, you know, erect those Confucius statues all over the place. So now you have, you know, this type of Confucius statues, you see, all over China. You find them in the underground, you find them, you know, in shopping malls, you know, just about everywhere, okay? And all about on the same model, which, by the way, is not the exactly the Chinese representation of Confucius, but it's inspired, you see, by the Jesuits, you see, representation of Confucius. So, I mean, all this makes for an interesting mixture, okay? So, the result of this rehabilitation of Confucius, you see, starting in the late 1970s and going on very strongly in the 1980s, was an unprecedented proliferation of conferences and publications revolving around the question, what is the relationship between Confucianism and the successful modernization over the last 30 years of the newly industrialized countries of East Asia? And more precisely, does Confucianism play an effective role in the development of capitalism, and is it a remedy for its malfunctions? So, taking a diametrically opposed stand to the ideas of Max Weber, certain Anglo-Saxon experts in the field of development established a causal relationship between the East Asian model of development and Confucian values, such as the importance of the family, respect of hierarchy, motivation for education, industriousness, and thrift. Ironically, all those factors which had appeared to be obstacles to capitalist development now promise to spare East Asian societies the problems affecting modern Western societies, okay? And I think, you know, I can hear some echoes of this also in the Indian context. So you seem to observe some sort of recurring mechanisms, you see, in this grappling, you know, with modernity, you know, coming from, you know, cultures which have, you know, a very long history, and trying to wonder what they will do with this, you know, weight of the past. So if Confucianism does not actually have a lot to do with economic development, it nevertheless served the interests of the authoritarian governments of Singapore, Beijing, and Seoul, which faced with a sudden acceleration in their economic development, that in a way their socio-political structures were unable to keep up with, those authoritarian governments found it convenient to make use for their own purposes of so-called Confucian values as a warrant for stability, discipline, and social order. And in declared opposition to the West, the decline of which, in contrast, was supposed to be the result of its individualism and hedonism. It should be noted that in this neo-authoritarianism, former Marxist and anti-Marxist ideologists coincided at least on one crucial point, that is, utopian representations of socialism without the West. That is very much the Maoist position, you know, socialism without the West. These utopian representations were to be replaced by the desire for economic modernity, also without the West, attained by means of post-modernity or post-Occidentalism, which in the Chinese context is a convenient alibi for short-circuiting political and democratic construction. Okay, so China has moved, you see, from socialism without the West to, let's say, economic prosperity or modernity also without the West, you see, and I see it, you know, as yet another alibi, I mean, to short-circuit the construction of democratic, you know, political space. So today, and I'm sort of now moving towards my conclusion, today, that is another 30 years or another generation after this spectacular bow turn of the Confucius economicus of the 1980s, as China is by now launched in a ruthless pursuit of economic growth by way of a somewhat savage form of capitalism, and launched in a dream. I'm talking about the present slogan, you know, I mean, China is all about, you know, the Chinese dream, okay, and launched in a dream of ascending power on a global scale. What has become of the return of Confucius, you see, you know, we've been talking about. So we are here talking about a very complex and fast evolving phenomenon, which can be said to affect not the whole of Chinese society, but punctually every segment and layer of Chinese society. So if we set aside the grossly ideological instrumentalization of Confucian-sounding slogans by the official discourse, such as the ideal of humane government, or the ideal of a harmonious society, or the wielding of Chinese so-called soft power through, for example, the proliferation worldwide of the Confucius Institutes, we can also observe all kinds of initiatives at grassroots level aiming at reappropriating fragments of the traditional and classical culture, such as the, let's say, the creation of some private schools. You know, you have one of those here on the picture, you know, with little children, you know, sort of attending some extracurricular let's say, training in the Confucian classics. With you have here a picture of Confucius here, you know, and some parents would, you know, sort of pay for the creation of these private schools, you see, for you know, sort of training their children in the let's say traditional Confucian learning, but you also have some crash courses on the classics for adults, you see, in universities, and also some intensive courses for businessmen, etc., you know, and of course all these courses are, you know, they are not free. I mean, you have to pay, and pay quite a lot for them, so it's a very lucrative activity for universities, you see. So I could make big money, you know, by selling Confucianism, you know, in Chinese universities, okay? So, and so, I'm just wondering, you know, well, what you know, I'm still doing in France, you see, which is sort of a country on the decline. But anyway, beside all this, you know, numerous academic circles in China are engaged in very hot debates about the reappropriation of Confucianism, whatever that means, in the contemporary Chinese context, which would contribute greatly to the mainstream discourse on the supposed Chinese characteristics, which is in actual fact yet another alibi to short-circuit once again the question of democratic construction. So, I mean, China has been, I mean, the Chinese official discourse has been very busy, you know, focusing on, you know, so-called Chinese characteristics, and Confucianism has appeared to be very convenient, you see, to be at the core of these Chinese characteristics. So you've had, you know, Chinese socialism, you know, with Chinese characteristics, you see, and now you have, then you had, you know, Chinese economics with Chinese characteristics, Chinese capitalism with Chinese characteristics, and now you have, you know, let's say, officially Confucianism has been, you know, consecrated as, you know, the core, you know, Chinese value. So in the meantime, elsewhere in East Asia and in America, the academics have been busy discussing from every possible viewpoint the relationships that could be worked out between Confucianism and prominent elements of Western modernity, such as democracy and human rights. And in particular, you have this endeavor coming from American academics trying to sort of strike a link between, you know, Confucianism and American pragmatism. You know, I don't have very much time to expand on this, but the idea is that you have some common ground, you see, between, let's say, Confucianism and its concern for educating the masses, you see, before moving them on, you know, to let's say democratic culture, and on the other hand, American, you know, pragmatism, such as it is represented by people like John Dewey or Richard Rorty, you see. So this is rather, you know, more philosophical. So I would leave it aside and. Move on, you know, directly to my conclusion. So we've seen Confucianism and its various vicissitudes, you see, over the past century and a half, and you've seen that Confucianism has had, against its will, its role to play, you know, in the question of Chinese modernization, you know. So, I mean, it has been sort of very convenient to, let's say, summarize the whole of Chinese traditional culture, you know, to be thrown overboard, you know, thrown overboard by the first modernists, you see, starting from the early 20th century, and then, you know, sort of coming, brought back again, you see, forefront. On the contrary, I mean, to represent the whole of Chinese culture, the greatness of Chinese culture and civilization, you see, and becoming, you know, a very convenient instrument, you know, in the Chinese official discourse nowadays, to represent, you know, you see, I mean, the core of Chinese values and the motor of the Chinese dream, okay, whatever it is, you see, I mean, so, and of course, you know, you can sense that I'm not in agreement, you see, with this let's say, perception of Confucianism, because as a historian, you know, I deal with text and I deal with historical evolution, and so I would remain rather critical about this. But what I really hope is that what I've just expounded, you know, would give rise to some echoes here in this very interesting Indian context, and I think it will. So thank you for your attention, and I expect quite a lot of questions from you. Thank you. So.